And for me, okay.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, getting justice for victims of Syrian war crimes. We will look at how European prosecutors in Germany and other countries are building cases against suspected perpetrators now living abroad.
And we welcome your thoughts on how justice can be achieved. Share your comments with us live on Twitter or in our YouTube chat.
Hi, this is Farida Deef, the Canada Director of Human Rights Watch, and you are in the stream.
Could a German national court help achieve justice for victims of Syrian war crimes? Investigators have been attempting to track down and prosecute Syrians who are believed to be responsible for torture and other atrocities committed during the country's 8-year civil war. Now, although the alleged war crimes occurred outside German borders, prosecutors are able to pursue these cases using a principle called universal jurisdiction. 2 arrests of former Syrian military intelligence officers were made earlier this year in Germany, and the first war crimes trial for a high-ranking Syrian official could happen in 2020.
So today we'll hear from those who are working to hold the Syrian government accountable. With us in Berlin, Alexandra Lilly-Cather, a legal advisor with the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights. Also in Berlin, Karam Mohammed, a Syrian human rights activist and photojournalist. And in Paris, Valerie Vaz, a legal consultant with Trial International.
Hello, guests. It's good to have you. Karam, I want to take you back to a time that was probably the worst time in your life when you were in detention in Syria. As you were experiencing torture, was there at any point that you felt that you would get justice, that people who were doing terrible things to you would actually have to serve time in court, time in prison, go to court? Was that even a concept that was possible?
I don't recall it being a concept that was actually possible. I mean, as a revolutionist, as someone who went out in demonstrations, there was always that feeling that we're going to get into jail for things that we're doing, not because it's unjust, not because it's illegal, but just because the dictatorship that we were facing was actually not okay with anything we were doing. So the concept of getting into jail was in my mind during all the demonstrations that I was going out in. But the concept of getting out of jail is so hard to be thought about. Mm-hmm. The accountability that you're asking me about was not something that I ever thought about when I was in jail. In jail, you live for the next day. You live feeling like you're going to die in the next hour. So it was not a concept that I was thinking of.
Valerie, the Syrian civil war is still ongoing. Who knows when it will end? So the concept of being able to trial war criminals right now, it feels very unusual, but that's what universal jurisdiction enables lawyers to do. It enables victims to actually maybe seek some justice. Can you explain quite simply how it works? So if someone like Karam was tortured in Syria, he now lives in Germany, how would universal jurisdiction work for the people who allegedly tortured him or tortured many other people?
Well, you exactly point out one of the things universal jurisdiction do, and it's not usual. It's allowing someone that is not from the country that is going to prosecute, where it was victim of crimes that were not committed in the country. They were committing abroad, and against victims that were not from the same country. And universal jurisdiction will allow him to get justice in this foreign state. So just to be clear, the jurisdiction of states is based on the territory. Normally, states will prosecute the crimes that are committed in their territory. But with universal jurisdictions, that's where it's exceptional. You're going to judge people that have, like for example in Syria, victims are Syrian, the perpetrator is Syrian, and the crime were committed in Syria. But nonetheless, they are judged and prosecuted and judged in Berlin. That's how it works. That's the principle of universal jurisdiction. And it's allowed for really grave crimes, crimes that we consider that are crimes against all humanity, all mankind, such as crimes against humanity, genocide, torture. And that's why we consider that it's so grave that every state should tackle the issue and try to prosecute the perpetrators.
Valerie, you mentioned grave crimes there, and I wanted to bring up this tweet reminding us all of what some of those crimes were. This from the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect. They write, throughout the 8-year war in Syria, every major principle of international law has been violated. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians, sexual violence, blockage of humanitarian aid, deliberate targeting of hospitals and humanitarian workers have been the hallmarks of this war. So keeping that in mind is why we see tweets like this. Jonah says, if there's no accountable government and sound judicial system in Syria, then it's better to have some kind of justice in German courts rather than nothing at all. Lily, why Germany though?
Germany has a quite broad universal jurisdiction legal framework, as Valerie already explained. But what's particular about Germany is that in comparison to other countries, for example, the Netherlands, the suspect needs to be in a territory for investigations even to open. And in Germany, we don't have such a requirement. That means our federal public prosecutor, he's allowed to go ahead with the investigation even if there's no such a suspect present. And I think what we need to also highlight here is that not only the trials are important, of course, it's really important that we are hopefully seeing the first ever trial addressing international crimes committed in Syria next year. But what's also important is that the German federal prosecutor has a tool to already preserve evidence. And they are doing this already since the end of 2011, December 2011. Since then, the German prosecutor is collecting photo evidence, video evidence, but most importantly, testimonies of survivors that are in Germany, that are in Europe, to bring such investigations forward.
I'm just thinking, Karam, about the refugees that are spread around Europe. Some of them have been, in your experience, have had similar experiences to you. And some of those refugees, or people who are living outside of Syria, some of those refugees are perpetrators as well. Tell us what you know about that, because I think sometimes we forget that not everybody who leaves the country is somebody who is a victim.
Yeah, I think what you're bringing up right now is something that also like the right wing maybe in Germany is also talking about, is using in a way to talk about like not every refugee is there because they need asylum, they're wanted in their countries. For me as someone who was detained before, and I was seeing all these people inside who were causing that torture and like that kind of death that everyone was facing inside Syria. Of course, it is traumatizing for me to see them in the streets or to even hear about them. It is both funny and sad to see them in Germany. I agree. Not everyone in Europe is someone who's there because they face some kind of torture or they need that. But I think we should emphasize on the idea that the largest number of Syrian refugees who are in Europe have faced some kind of torture. And also we should emphasize on the idea that the Syrian regime is the biggest and the most brazen war criminal in Syria that caused for lots of detentions, hundreds of thousands of deaths. But also there are some other flags that have been in Syria and other parties who also caused for some detentions and some death for some other parts of Syria. So yeah, the idea is people are here in Europe seeking asylum. Of course, there are people amongst us who caused for death and caused for lots of torture for us. The main way to maybe like be just to us as former detainees and for these hundreds of thousands who are living right now in the Syrian jails under that dictator is to take them to European courts.
You're not the only one who believes that this is one of the ways to be just to those victims. I want to play a video comment from someone named Mark. He's a student at McGill Law in Canada and also a consultant, and he talks about this being a form of justice. Have a listen.
International justice has done very little for Syria, yet Syria has done a lot for international justice. That includes reinvigorating the idea of universal jurisdiction. The best prospects for justice and accountability for atrocities committed in Syria today don't exist in an international court, and they don't exist in Syria. They exist in a country 4,000 kilometers away, Germany. That symbolism shouldn't be lost on us. These are amongst the worst crimes that we have witnessed since the Nazi regime in Germany. So if we don't have the political will to achieve justice at international courts, and it can't be done in Syria, at the very, very least, we can listen to victims, collect the evidence that they carry, and use it whenever possible and wherever possible to narrow the gap between the supply and demand for justice in Syria.
So Lily, he says at the very least, we can be listening to victims. Talk to us about some of the cases that you know are being gathered right now and investigated, and how you're getting the evidence for them.
So the organization I work for, ECCHR, we've been investigating international crimes committed in Syria by all parties of the conflict, and I think that's also an important point mentioned by Karam. And we've done so since about 2012. By the end of 2016, we collaborated and really started working with Syrian activists in Berlin and Syrian lawyers who brought their work and their organizations from Syria to Europe and continued their activism, continued their political work. And together with them, we identified survivors who were willing to work with us on those cases. So how we investigate what has happened in those quite secret detention facilities in Syria is by first and foremost, of course, listening to the stories of former detainees, but also to the stories of the family that started missing their sons, their daughters, their brothers, their fathers, their husband, and what also their perspective is on how they try to find them, etc. And then, of course, there are a bunch of important reports, such by the UN Commission of Inquiry on Syria, but also by international human rights organizations such as Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. But also what I really would like to highlight here is the documentation work that has been done rigorously since the beginning of the revolution, and even before that, on the system of torture that's being employed as an oppressive tool by the Assad government against those that took the streets of Damascus and beyond. So these are sort of the sources we are working with, but a form of evidence that I would also like to speak about are the Caesar photos. So these are tens of thousands of photos that have been taken by a former military photographer that was operating in military hospitals in Syria on behalf of the government. And he, at some point in time, decided to take those photos out of these facilities and together with the team analyze them and then eventually take them out of Syria. And these photos depict really the consequences of the torture and other crimes committed in these facilities. So we have quite good visual evidence of such crimes, and the photos also let us assume certain information to command responsibility, because also the dead bodies of the detainees essentially show not only what physically this person and these persons have experienced, but they also show, for example, the place where the person was last detained. And if we know where the person has been last detained, we can research who has been in charge of that very detention facility. And if we know who has been in charge, we know who is the person who did not only know about these crimes being committed, but who in often cases, if not always, also ordered for such crimes to be committed against the detainees that have been arbitrarily detained there.
Valerie, you were going to say something a little bit earlier. Go ahead. What do you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on Karam's experience, and he was talking about the fact that some perpetrators, some suspected criminals, are also hiding in the refugees, and this was also. It's also creating a window of opportunity for universal jurisdiction for states like Germany, France, Switzerland, from European states, to try to fight impunity and to make sure no safe haven will be granted for those war criminals. So indeed, it's been like 5 years or so. We see that the universal jurisdiction is growing a lot. With our organization, Trial International, we published a report on those cases of universal jurisdiction. It's called the UGR, and we try to show that actually this is happening not only in Germany. You have many Syrian in Germany, and so many cases about Syria in Germany, but you also have some cases in Sweden, in France, and you also have cases about all the other situations, such as Liberia, Rwanda. You have many cases around the world, and it's true that the last 5 years it's been a lot about Syrian cases, thanks to the window of opportunity that the refugee migration gave us. Because with the perpetrators, you have also witnesses. You also have victims. And as Lily was saying, getting the proof, the evidence in your cases, it's very hard. You need to imagine, like prosecutors are national prosecutors, so they are not used to work in cases, international cases. They are now a bit more, because we've been created, like it has been created in Europe, several war crimes units.
So Valerie, let me just highlight this for people, because what it means is that if you're a national prosecutor, you may not even have a budget to travel to different places where you need to gather the evidence. So you may well be stuck in your home country, your home city, and not be able to go anywhere. How do you investigate if you can't go anywhere? That is problematic. Karam, what were you going to say? Go ahead.
I was about to ask my colleagues who are with me in the call about the idea that, okay, as a Syrian, I do actually believe in the value and the importance of international judiciary and international law, but I tend to not believe in the functionality of it. We've seen international institutions, the UN, and all the decisions regarding Syria failing. So what do you guys do when it comes to trying to make Syrians who are in Europe believing in the functionality of it? Do you get many Syrians who wants to talk about their cases, to try to talk about the names of the people who tortured them back in Syria?
Lily, you take that one. You start.
Yeah, sure. I mean, before I get to your question, Karam, I think I want us to go a bit back from the narrative of among the refugees are perpetrators in Europe. I think that's really true, but I think there are two approaches to universal jurisdiction. One is certainly states also politically utilizing it and saying we only go after the suspects that are on our territory. But actually, there's another idea that we can use universal jurisdiction for, and that is to actually globally enforce international criminal law. And international criminal law, despite its fault and its flaws and it being embedded in, of course, political dynamics. And I very much hear you, Karam, and that's also all the activists and survivors I know. There is a loss of hope and increasing frustration because the body who has been established after the Second World War, the United Nations, has tremendously failed Syria and the Syrian community in responding adequately for political reasons. But I think what we should focus on is really using the legal tools that we have, and that could work. And for now, that's universal jurisdiction. And that's why I encourage us to really concentrate our efforts there, because really we cannot change what Russia is saying. We cannot change what China is doing, or Iran, who is coming up where. We can remain critical of it. And of course, we need to watch what's happening and why. But I think if what we can do is really to use
Karam,
what we have.
But what Karam asked, and I think it was a really poignant question, was because he's given testimony. He's talking to other people who may well want to come forward. Why would they do that? Why would they bare their soul? Why would they go back to terrible things that have happened to them if the process doesn't work? That's what he's really asking. Valerie, you pick up on that.
Yeah, the process actually does work, not every time, and it's hard. Criminal cases in general are really complicated in national system, but imagine in universal jurisdiction cases, where, as I was mentioning, like the search for evidence is super complicated for prosecutor, and everything gets more complicated. Even like finding witnesses. How do you do that when you're a prosecutor, national prosecutor, and you have to find witnesses for your case? And then once you find some witnesses, to make them agree to testify, this is something, again, more difficult because for security reasons.
Valerie, let me just push you because Karam was very brief and to the point. He wanted to know, does it work? You say, yes, it does work.
Yeah, it does work. Right. We can see some cases, I mean, for now, Syrian cases, we are starting to see some results. Like, of course, we have arrest warrants in France and in Germany against high-ranked officials of the Syrian regime. You had 3 persons that were arrested, 2 in Germany, 1 in France. And among them, at least we know one of them is a high-ranked, and the other one in France, we don't know exactly his position, but like we know that it's a person from officials. And we need to keep in mind that other cases in situations that seems really impossible, such as the Hissene Habre case, it's a former president of Chad. It seemed impossible to judge him, to make him end his day in jail, and yet it happened. Why? Because witnesses, NGOs, local NGOs, and witnesses testified. So it's very important, and it's very hard, very difficult about like protecting the witnesses and the victim on the ground. And it's why NGOs in Syria are doing an amazing job, and it's thanks to them that we can move forward, and thanks to their courage.
You mentioned the victims on the ground, and Karam, I want to go to you with this because there are people online who say they do have hope that this will work. To your question that you're asking, this is Veronica, and she says that for her, the important thing is that these trials in Germany are victim-centered, with Syrians being able to send a complaint to police or prosecutors and make submissions and more. She goes on to say being able to contribute directly to the trials will finally allow Syrians to tell their story and to face their torturers in a court of law. And she speaks from personal experience. As the wife of a survivor of torture in Assad's regime detentions, I know how important it is for my husband to see his torturer finally in prison and not allowed to walk freely in Europe or Syria, while Syrians are still facing the psychological scars left by the torture. So of course, Karam, that's only one anecdote there for someone who feels hopeful. But for you, can you relate to what she's saying? Do you have hope?
Of course I can. Yeah, of course I can. I do have hope. The idea is, I think I was misunderstood in a way, because the fact that I was talking about is human rights activists, revolutionists, people who were detained. Of course, it is a matter of just for them to tell their stories and keep telling it. But it's an 8 years revolution that has been going, and some people went hopeless. For me personally, I think I always tell my story. Me, my mom, and my brother are writing a novel about the things that we faced. So I do believe in the importance of telling the story and keep telling it for everyone. I just feel like the functionality, explain it to normal people who were detained, especially because we're talking about hundreds of thousands, is hard. Do I have hope that things are gonna go into some, I don't know, like into some accountability and justice inside Syria? This is a very large question when it comes to the fact that everything is happening right now inside Syria is a bit to the side of the regime, the expansion of like the territory that the regime is taking over, and also like everyone is withdrawing from that and leaving it for Iran, Russia, and the regime to do whatever they want. So the hope when it comes to what? When it comes to the detention of some of those who tortured Syrians, yes. Hope for the future of Syria that something is going to happen and it's going to be constructive. People are going to go back. We're not going to stay in Europe. We're not going to stay outside of Syria. I do have that hope. But in general, a hope in international law, international system, they failed us a lot. We were failed during the Syrian revolution many times. Many red lights have been crossed. Many people died because no one cared. UN investigators were in Damascus when demonstrations were attacked.
Karam, we're going to end on that skeptical voice, but pragmatic one. We really thank you for your time. Thank you to Karam, to Lily and Valerie. Malika, how's this conversation been going down online?
Interesting. I'll end with this from Syria Justice and Accountability, who says a full accounting for war crimes is not possible until Syria is prepared to grapple with violations. But this court is the last refuge for Syrian victims.
Thank you, guests. Thank you, viewers, for watching. See you next time.